December 13, 1943. The morning sky over Assam, India hung heavy with monsoon humidity as Second Lieutenant Philip Adair walked toward his P-40 Warhawk fighter at Nagaguli Airfield. The massive white skull painted on the nose of his aircraft, number 44, nicknamed Lulu Belle, gleamed in the early light. Behind him, the rest of D Flight was just beginning their pre-flight checks when the alarm screamed across the airfield. Enemy aircraft inbound, dozens of them, headed straight for the base. Adair was a farm boy from Tuttle, Oklahoma, who'd grown up watching Army Air Corps pilots buzz his family's property from the nearby airfield at Wichita Falls. Those early sightings had planted a seed that would eventually grow into an obsession. After graduating high school in 1937 with no money for college, he'd taken a job selling candy, saving every penny to pay for flying lessons. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, Adair already had his pilot's license. The Army Air Corps accepted him as a cadet almost immediately. After advanced training at Luke Field in Arizona, Adair was assigned to the 89th Fighter Squadron of the 80th Fighter Group. In the spring of 1943, his unit received classified orders that would take them halfway around the world. They were being shipped to India to protect one of the most critical and dangerous operations of the entire war, the Hump airlift. Allied transport planes were flying supplies over the Himalayan mountains from India into China, supporting Chinese forces and American units fighting the Japanese from the east. It was the only supply line keeping the China-Burma-India Theater operational, and the Japanese knew it. The northern route of the Hump was a killing ground. Japanese fighters from bases in Burma routinely attacked the unarmed transport planes as they struggled over the mountains. Every cargo aircraft that went down meant tons of supplies lost, crews killed, and the lifeline to China weakened. The 80th Fighter Group's mission was simple on paper, but brutally difficult in execution. Protect the transports, engage the Japanese fighters, and keep the supply line open at all costs. The unit quickly earned a reputation that would echo through military history. They painted death's head skulls on the noses of their P-40s, and some pilots mounted air raid sirens on the belly of their aircraft. When activated during attack runs, these sirens created an unholy wailing sound that could be heard for miles, a psychological weapon that struck terror into Japanese ground forces and pilots alike. The locals started calling them the Burma Banshees, and the name stuck. It was a title they wore with fierce pride. For Adair, December 13th would mark his 44th combat mission. By pure coincidence, he would be flying aircraft number 44, his beloved Lulu Belle. He'd added his own personal touch to the death skull on the nose, streams of blood dripping from the teeth. It was intimidation, yes, but it was also a statement about what they faced every single day in the skies over Burma and India. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk that Adair climbed into that morning was not the most advanced fighter in the Allied arsenal, and everyone who flew it knew that cold hard fact. The P-40 had been designed in the late 1930s as a modification of the earlier P-36 Hawk, fitted with an Allison V1710 liquid-cooled engine that produced around 1,300 horsepower in the later N-model variants. It was a workhorse, not a thoroughbred. The sleek P-38 Lightning could outperform it at altitude. The nimble P-51 Mustang would eventually prove superior in almost every performance category. But in late 1943, in the China-Burma-India Theater, the P-40 was what they had, and pilots like Adair had learned to make it work. The P-40 had specific strengths that made it surprisingly effective in the hands of pilots who understood its capabilities. It was rugged beyond belief. The liquid-cooled Allison engine was vulnerable to coolant system damage, true, but the overall airframe could absorb punishment that would have torn lesser fighters to pieces. Self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating behind the pilot's seat, and armored glass in the windscreen meant that P-40s regularly brought their pilots home despite horrific battle damage. The aircraft had an exceptional dive speed, reaching over 360 miles per hour in a steep descent, faster than most Japanese fighters could achieve. And its armament was respectable. 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, with enough ammunition for sustained combat. But the P-40 had limitations that every pilot had to respect. Its climb rate was mediocre at best, especially at altitude. It couldn't turn with the nimble Japanese fighters in a traditional dogfight. Above 20,000 feet, its performance degraded noticeably as the single-stage supercharger struggled to feed the engine enough air. Pilots who tried to fight the Japanese on their terms, turning and climbing in classic aerial combat, usually ended up dead. So American pilots in the CBI theater, trained by men like Claire Chennault, who'd founded the famous Flying Tigers, developed different tactics. They called it boom and zoom. Use the P-40's superior diving speed and structural strength to attack from above. Make one devastating pass with all 6 guns blazing, then dive away before the enemy could react. Never turn, never try to climb with them. Use altitude and speed to dictate the terms of engagement. Hit hard, hit fast, and get out. It wasn't romantic dogfighting from the movies, but it kept you alive, and it killed the enemy. That was the only metric that mattered. Against the Japanese that morning, Adair would be flying the P-40N variant, one of the lightest and fastest of the Warhawk family. The N model had achieved some weight reduction compared to earlier versions, pushing its top speed to around 378 miles per hour in level flight. But it still carried the same 650 caliber guns, and that firepower was about to become critically important. The Japanese formation heading toward Nagaguli that December morning represented a standard Japanese Army Air Force bombing mission profile. Intelligence would later confirm the composition: 24 Mitsubishi K-21 bombers, codenamed Sally by the Allies, escorted by 40 Nakajima K-43 fighters, codenamed Oscar. 64 aircraft total, organized in a tight defensive formation designed to maximize their collective firepower and mutual protection. The K-21 Sally was Japan's primary heavy bomber for the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, though by late 1943 it was showing its age. A twin-engine design with a crew of 5 to 7, it could carry up to 2,200 pounds of bombs at a maximum speed of around 302 miles per hour. The Sally had all-metal construction with a mid-wing configuration and retractable landing gear, representing relatively modern design for its era. But its defensive armament was weak by American standards, typically one 12.7mm machine gun in a dorsal turret, plus several 7.7mm guns in nose, tail, ventral, and beam positions. Against the concentrated firepower of American fighters, these guns were barely adequate. The Nakajima K-43 Oscar fighters provided the bomber escort, and they were far more formidable opponents. The Oscar was the most widely produced Japanese Army fighter of the entire war, with over 5,900 built. It was exceptionally maneuverable thanks to its butterfly pattern combat flaps and light weight. Early models weighed only around 4,500 pounds fully loaded, compared to the P-40's 8,000 pounds or more. This gave the Oscar extraordinary agility in turning fights. Pilots who survived combat against Oscars reported watching them execute double Immelmann maneuvers and snap into turns that seemed to defy physics. But the Oscar paid a heavy price for that maneuverability. Like most early Japanese fighters, it sacrificed protection for performance. Early versions lacked armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks, making them vulnerable to even a few hits from American 50 caliber machine guns. And the Oscar's armament was woefully inadequate. Initially just 2 7.7mm machine guns, later upgraded to 2 12.7mm weapons. Against American fighters built like tanks, Oscar pilots often found themselves firing continuously at targets that simply refused to go down. The formation heading toward Adair's base that morning represented a significant threat. 24 bombers carrying tons of high explosives could devastate the airfield, destroy parked aircraft, collapse hangars, crater runways, and kill dozens of personnel. The base hospital, supply depots, and maintenance facilities were all vulnerable, and 40 escort fighters meant that any attempt to intercept the bombers would face overwhelming opposition. Standard doctrine called for meeting such a raid with at least equal numbers, preferably a numerical advantage. Send up a full squadron, coordinate attacks from multiple angles, divide the enemy formation, separate the bombers from their escorts. But doctrine assumed you had time to get your fighters airborne and organized. As Adair's engine roared to life and Lulu Belle started rolling toward the runway, he looked around and realized with sinking certainty that he was it. The other pilots were still running to their aircraft. The ground crews were frantically removing wheel chocks and starting engines. In the time it would take to get the full flight assembled and airborne, the Japanese would be over the base, bombs falling. This was Philip Adair's 44th mission. He was 23 years old, and he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He didn't wait. He pushed the throttle forward, pointed Lulu Belle down the runway, and took off alone to face 64 enemy aircraft. The mathematics were insane. 64 to 1. Even if he were the best pilot who ever lived, even if every bullet hit, even if the enemy made catastrophic mistakes, the odds said he should be dead within minutes. His 650 caliber guns carried 425 rounds each, 3,400 rounds total. The Japanese had hundreds of machine guns and cannons between them. If this became a straight fight, a slugging match in the air, simple mathematics guaranteed his defeat. But Adair wasn't planning a straight fight. As Lulu Belle climbed away from Nagahuli, precious altitude accumulating second by second, he was already running through his tactical options. The bombers were the real threat. 40 fighters couldn't destroy the base by themselves, but 24 bombers absolutely could. If he engaged the fighters first, he'd waste ammunition and time while the bombers reached their target unmolested. He'd lose by winning. The only play, the only possible strategy that made any sense was to go straight for the bombers and hope chaos did the rest. American pilots in the CBI had developed a specific technique for attacking bomber formations, the high side diving pass. Get above them, roll inverted, pull the nose down, and dive through the formation at maximum speed. The closing rate would be so high that defensive gunners couldn't track effectively. Fire from maximum range to rattle the bomber crews. Watch their formation loosen as pilots instinctively pulled away from the tracer fire streaking toward them. Then extend in the dive. Use that speed to zoom climb back to altitude before the escorts could react and set up for another pass. It required precision, nerve, and perfect timing. It also required that you not think too hard about what would happen if you miscalculated and ended up in the middle of that formation at slow speed, with 40 fighters diving on your head. Adair climbed Lulu Belle to altitude, watching the Japanese formation resolve from distant specks into distinct aircraft. He could see them organized in their classic pattern. Bombers in tight elements of 6 aircraft each, 4 elements total, making 24 bombers. The fighters were stacked above, below, and to the sides in a layered defensive box. It was a formation designed to create overlapping fields of fire, to make any attack run a gauntlet of bullets and cannon shells. Japanese bomber and fighter crews were experienced, disciplined, professional. They'd done this hundreds of times. They knew how to protect each other. But they weren't expecting a single P-40 to come screaming out of the sun above them like an avenging angel. Adair rolled Lulu Belle inverted and pulled the nose down. The airspeed needle climbed steadily as gravity and 1,200 horsepower added together into a dive that would have terrified any sane person. 300 miles per hour, 320, 350. The P-40 structure groaned under the aerodynamic loads, but held. This was what the aircraft was built for: brutal, high-speed combat maneuvers that would tear fragile fighters apart. At what Adair later estimated was around 800 yards, well beyond effective range, he opened fire. All 6 50 caliber guns hammered in unison, their combined rate of fire dumping nearly 100 rounds per second into the air ahead of him. Tracer rounds, loaded every 5th bullet, drew bright lines across the sky directly toward the lead bomber element. The bombers saw those tracers coming and reacted exactly as Adair hoped. They flinched. Pilots pulled up, pushed down, broke formation just slightly as human instinct overrode discipline. Their tight bombing pattern loosened, their careful formation discipline wavered. And then Adair was through them, diving at over 400 miles per hour, pulling hard on the stick to convert that speed into altitude in a zoom climb that carried Lulu Belle back above the fight. The 40 escort fighters had seen him. They were reacting now, turning toward him, climbing to intercept. But he already had altitude and speed, and for a few precious seconds, he could reset for another pass. Later, in the combat debriefing, Adair would describe these moments with remarkable clarity. He'd fired into the formation from long range, not expecting to hit anything vital, but to create psychological pressure. Japanese bomber crews had seen the tracer fire, heard bullets hitting aircraft, felt their formation's cohesion shake. Some of the bombs had already been released, but the careful timing necessary for accurate bombing was disrupted. The bombs would miss their intended targets by hundreds of yards. But Adair wasn't done. The fighters were climbing toward him now, a swarm of Oscars coming fast. He had seconds to choose: bug out and hope the disrupted bombers would turn back, or press the attack and try for actual kills. Later, when asked why he didn't disengage at that point, having already accomplished something remarkable, Adair would say simply, "They were still coming for my base. The job wasn't finished." He dove again. This time the Japanese were ready. Defensive gunners in the bombers tracked him, streams of tracer fire reaching out like searching fingers. The escort fighters were turning hard, trying to cut him off. Adair selected a bomber that had become separated from the main formation, probably damaged or struggling with mechanical issues. He closed to effective range, 300 yards, and held the trigger. 650 caliber guns focused on a single target created a cone of destruction that nothing could survive. The bomber's wing exploded in a shower of aluminum fragments. Fuel sprayed, ignited, became a trailing comet. The aircraft rolled inverted and went down. Confirmed kill, 1. But now the Oscars were on him. Adair broke hard left, pulling every pound of G-force the P-40 structure could handle. Tracers slashed past his canopy. He reversed, snap-rolled, domadan. An Oscar crossed in front of him, a deflection shot that required instinct more than calculation. He fired. Saw strikes along the Oscar's fuselage. The fighter's landing gear detoyed unexpectedly, a sign of hydraulic failure or control damage. Smoke poured from the engine cowling. The Oscar nosed over and spiraled toward the jungle below. Confirmed kill, 2. More Oscars now, attacking from multiple directions. Adair's combat report would note 5 to 7 fighters engaging him simultaneously. He was in the fight of his life, a swirling, three-dimensional dogfight where every mistake would be fatal. He used every trick in the book: chandelles, split S maneuvers, rolling scissors, high G barrel rolls. The P-40 couldn't turn with the Oscars, but it was faster in the dive and had better rolling rate. Adair fought in the vertical, trading altitude for speed, speed for position, position for brief firing opportunities. And then his luck ran out. Cannon shells and machine gun bullets found Lulu Belle. The canopy shattered. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit. The engine cowling was torn away by an exploding 20mm shell. Fire erupted behind the instrument panel. Adair felt impacts, shrapnel and bullet fragments hitting his face and leg. The nose of the aircraft tried to pitch down violently. The elevator controls, the system that controlled the aircraft's pitch, were damaged or destroyed. In any other fighter, this would have been the end. The pilot would bail out, hope his parachute deployed correctly, hope he landed somewhere the Japanese wouldn't find him. But Adair tried pulling back on the stick and got almost no response. The P-40 wanted to nose down, wanted to dive into the jungle. The elevator trim tabs, small control surfaces that could adjust the elevator's angle, were either damaged or had lost hydraulic pressure. He was trying to fly an aircraft that actively wanted to kill him. And then Philip Adair did something that had probably never been done before, and has rarely been done since. If the aircraft wanted to nose down when flying right side up, he would fly it upside down. He rolled Lulu Belle inverted. Suddenly, the control pressures reversed. What had been a disastrous nose-down tendency became useful when the aircraft was inverted. He could control altitude by rolling between upright and inverted flight, using the aircraft's damaged control system against itself. He started the 100-mile journey back to base, alternating between normal and inverted flight to maintain altitude and heading. Over the radio, he contacted control, his voice remarkably calm given the circumstances, explaining his situation. The controller on the ground initially didn't understand. An inverted P-40 approaching the field? It seemed impossible. As Adair neared Nagaguli, ground crews and anti-aircraft gunners saw an aircraft approaching upside down at low altitude, with wheels extended. They very nearly opened fire on what they assumed must be a Japanese fighter attempting some sort of attack. Adair was seconds away from being shot down by his own side, when someone recognized the white skull on the nose, recognized Lulu Belle's markings, and screamed into the radio to hold fire. At the last possible moment, Adair rolled the P-40 upright, flared with what little control authority he had left, and somehow got the aircraft onto the runway. It was less a landing than a controlled crash, but Lulu Belle held together. The engine quit as the fighter rolled to a stop. Fuel was pouring from ruptured tanks. Ground crews sprinted toward the aircraft with fire extinguishers. When they pulled Adair from the cockpit, he was bleeding from facial wounds and his leg was injured, but he was conscious and talking. Behind him, Lulu Belle looked like she'd thrown through a metal shredder. The crew chief would later report stopping his count of bullet and cannon holes at over 200. The engine had taken direct hits. Control cables were partially severed. 3 of the 4 main longerons, the structural beams that formed the fuselage's backbone, were shot through. By every engineering principle, the aircraft shouldn't have been flyable, but she'd brought him home. Intelligence officers debriefed Adair extensively about the engagement. His report documented 2 confirmed kills, 1 Sally bomber and 1 Oscar fighter. He also claimed 2 probable kills, a second Oscar that he'd seen smoking and trailing fire, and another bomber that had appeared to be catastrophically damaged. Other pilots from the 80th Fighter Group who got airborne during the attack confirmed seeing Japanese aircraft going down and the bomber formation breaking apart before they could complete their attack run. More importantly, the bombing rate had been disrupted. Some bombs hit the airfield and surrounding area, but the primary targets, the hangars, fuel storage, ammunition dumps, and parked aircraft, suffered minimal damage. A few personnel were wounded, but there were no fatalities. The hospital was untouched. The supply depot survived. In military terms, the raid was a failure. The Burma Banshees would be flying missions again the next day. For his actions on December 13, 1943, 2nd Lieutenant Philip Adair was awarded the Silver Star, the third highest military decoration for valor.
The citation noted his extraordinary heroism in engaging a force of 64 enemy aircraft single-handedly, disrupting their attack and defending his base despite being heavily outnumbered. It was a formal recognition of something that should have been impossible. But more than the medal, more than the official recognition, what mattered to Adair and his squadron mates was simpler. He'd done his job. The base survived. The supplies kept flowing. The Hump airlift continued. In a war where strategic logistics often mattered more than tactical victories, keeping that supply line open was worth more than a dozen aerial dogfights. Philip Adair would go on to fly a total of 139 combat missions with the 80th Fighter Group. He became an ace, officially credited with 5 victories, though many pilots believed his actual total was higher given the chaos of CBI combat operations, where confirmation was often impossible. In May 1944, he would again face overwhelming odds when his flight of 4 P-40s engaged 15 Japanese Oscars.
He claimed 2 more confirmed victories in that engagement, once again demonstrating the combination of tactical brilliance, raw courage, and maybe a little bit of that Oklahoma farm boy stubbornness that defined his combat career. After the war, Adair remained in the Air Force, eventually retiring as a colonel. He rarely talked about his exploits unless directly asked, a common trait among that generation of combat veterans. They'd done what was necessary, what duty required, and then moved on with their lives. He married, had children, enjoyed a long career. He collected Packard automobiles, beautiful luxury cars from the 1930s and 40s. He went fishing. He lived. When Adair died in 2017 at the age of 97, he was laid to rest at Quantico National Cemetery with full military honors. Pilots from the Flying Circus, a group of aviation enthusiasts who flew vintage Stearman biplanes, performed the missing man formation over his grave. One aircraft peeled away from the formation, leaving a gap in the sky, symbolizing the hole left by a fallen pilot's departure. It was a final tribute to a man who'd once faced impossible odds and somehow, impossibly, survived. The story of December 13, 1943 became legendary within the 80th Fighter Group. New pilots arriving in the CBI would hear about it during their first week at the base, the day Lieutenant Adair took on 64 Japanese aircraft alone and came back alive. It became a teaching moment, an example of what could be accomplished with the right tactics, the right mindset, and maybe a little bit of luck. But it also highlighted something larger about the air war in the China-Burma-India Theater. The pilots flying over Burma, India, and China were operating thousands of miles from home in brutal climate conditions with equipment that was often second-rate compared to what their counterparts received in Europe or the Pacific. They flew missions that rarely made headlines back home. The CBI was called the Forgotten Theater for good reason, yet what they accomplished was strategically vital. The Hump airlift delivered over 650,000 tons of supplies to China during the war, supporting Chinese forces who tied down hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops that might otherwise have been deployed to the Pacific Islands. The 80th Fighter Group and units like it made that airlift possible by protecting the transport planes and attacking Japanese air bases, supply lines, and troop concentrations. And sometimes, when the situation demanded it, a single pilot in a beat-up P-40 with a skull painted on the nose would do something that seemed impossible and make it look like just another day at the office. The P-40 Warhawk never gets the recognition that the Mustang or the Thunderbolt receive in popular histories of World War II. It was older, slower, less refined. But in the hands of pilots who understood its strengths and respected its limitations, the Warhawk was a deadly weapon system. The Burma Banshees proved that over and over again in the skies above India and Burma. Today, if you visit aviation museums or talk to historians who specialize in the CBI theater, they'll tell you stories about the men who flew those missions. They'll show you photos of P-40s with shark mouths and death skulls sitting on jungle airstrips ready for the next mission. They'll talk about Claire Chennault and the Flying Tigers, about the Hump pilots who flew over the Himalayas in all weather, about fighter pilots who faced overwhelming odds and somehow found ways to win. And if you're lucky,
They might tell you about December 13, 1943, when Second Lieutenant Philip Adair looked at a formation of 64 enemy aircraft heading toward his base and decided that one P-40 was enough to stop them. Because sometimes courage and skill and determination can overcome mathematics. Sometimes one person can make a difference that changes everything. And sometimes flying inverted is exactly the right solution to an impossible problem. If you enjoyed learning about this incredible piece of World War II history, please hit that like button and subscribe to WW2 Tales for more stories of courage, innovation, and the remarkable individuals who shaped the outcome of the greatest conflict in human history. There are thousands of stories remembered and shared.
Help us keep these memories alive by joining our community. Until next time, remember that history isn't just about nations and armies. It's about individuals who faced impossible situations and found ways to overcome them.